Hello, my name is Royal Banks. I am a senior at Goucher College, majoring in history and concentrating in secondary education. For my senior capstone, I will be focusing on exploring the containment of Jamaican Maroon societies by me. Let's go ahead and get started. So, the first thing that I'm going to focus on is just the historical context of my project. And I'm going to focus on four main points. The first being location, Jamaica. And I'm just going to talk about its geography and the natural barriers and how it worked in the maroon favors when escaping plantations and keeping colonial power away. The next would be the transition of colonial power from the Spanish to the English. Next being the first Maroon War between 1729 and it ended in 1739. And the last would be the first treaty when it was signed in 1739 by Cujo. So those are the first four points I'm going to focus on within my project. So let's go ahead and get started with the location. Now I'm going to focus on the geography of the island. This is a map of Jamaica, and this is going to give you a better idea as to where the two bands that I'm mostly focusing on was located. So at the top of the island, the Montego Bay, St. James area, this is where Cujo Town was located. So this is where the Leeward band reside. This area was very popular for where most of the slaves would try to escape to, just because it was a lot closer and it wasn't as hilly and it wasn't as vegetated as the Blue Mountains were, and it was a shorter travel depending on where the slaves were coming from. In the Blue Mountains area, more so towards the St. Andrews, St. Thomas area, this is where the Windward band was located in the Blue Mountains. So they did not receive as much as disruption as Cujo Town did, but Cujo really and he put a lot of tactics within the band that really limited these disruptions from English by not killing white people or not when they raided they would only take slaves or they would only take certain resources but they would not kill colonial power. So that kind of worked in their favor, as in when the English would try to disrupt these bands, they would last go to Cujo Town. I don't really have much to say. It's kind of like the same information. However, I just want to include a more updated or a modern map of Jamaica. So in the cockpit country, that is where the Leeward band was located, as we have the Cujo Town and stuff. And then towards the bottom, we have the Blue Mountains, and that's where the Windward band was located. Now I'm going to focus on the transition of colonial power in Jamaica. So before 1660, Jamaica was owned by the Spaniards. However, in 1660, they had this new transition where the English now own Jamaica and the island and what happened on it. So I'm going to talk briefly just about this transition. It kind of left an open area for the former slaves of the Spaniards to kind of figure out, what they were going to do as the English transitioned in. So, with this newfound freedom, in a sense, they took this as an opportunity to escape, not necessarily escape, but they went into the interiors of the island. Now, a lot of historians, they would like to call this group of the former slaves as the first maroon groups, technically. I know that a lot of historians, they recognize the Leeward and the Windward bands as the first few successful maroon bands. However, there are a few historians who view the former slaves of the Spanish that were still there as the first group of Maroons in Jamaica. So, again, with this new transition of this new island for the English, and they just had that loss in Roanoke. So they needed some way of getting the economics for this new colony that they're on, which is in Jamaica. So they kind of import more slaves in Jamaica, which definitely has a huge impact on these maroon groups. So with the increase of slaves and being placed on larger sugar plantations, it kind of increased the amount of runaway slaves going into the interiors of the island. And again, for both the Leeward and the Windward, they did plenty of plantation raids where they would take slaves or they would take certain resources in order to help their bands, their particular bands that they were in. However, they mostly focused on helping runaways get into the interior of the island. So that was very important. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the years of turmoil, and that was between 1655 to 1740, which is 85 years of turmoil between colonial power and maroon bands. And again, this is an interesting time period for Jamaica just because for the last 10 years of this turmoil was the first Maroon War. However, between that time, it was mostly just revolts against colonial power, and colonial power revolting back against these new Maroon bands that are kind of just popping up. Because again, the two that I'm mainly focusing on is the Windward and the Leeward band, but there were so many bands that were created during this time period. So there was plenty of revolts that happened from 1655 until 1740. And I think that this is definitely an interesting time because for the start of this turmoil, it's the last 5 years that the Spaniards are in Jamaica. So they're kind of having that interesting time period for them. And then it transitions into the new colonial power of the English. So this is definitely an interesting time period for Jamaica because they're transitioning into a new colonial power. However, they're still going through these political issues, which kind of leads us into the First Maroon War, which I'll talk briefly about in the next few slides coming. The next thing that I'm going to focus on is the First Maroon War. This started in 1729 near the Cave River area. This was located in the St. Andrews, St. Thomas area, which was in the Windward Band's territory. And it ended in 1739 near the Goucher town, which was the Leeward Band territory. The natural barriers of the island, the full island, was something that colonial power took a while to get used to. However, for many of the Maroon bands, this was something that they kind of practice on a day-to-day efforts in order to keep the bands up, in order to find food, in order to, revolt or to actually go on their plantation raids. They were used to this terrain. They were used to the vegetation of the area. So the natural barriers of the island was, again, it worked in their favor because, one, many of the colonial power in the plantations, they weren't able to reach a lot of the bands because, again, the hilly area and the vegetation of the island was just, again, it was something that they weren't used to. So the geography and the natural barriers were something that, again, the Maroons, it worked in their favor. Both Leeward and the Windward bands, they displayed highly skillful tactics. Now, this was something that worked in their favor all the time, just because they were so organized and they had so many procedures. I don't think they called it procedures during that time period. However, they had so many procedures and they had all of these acts as to like what they're going to do when they have a plantation raid. What are they going to grab? What's the most important thing? And how are they going to revolt? Who do they go for when they're revolting against colonial power? They had tactics that worked in their favor, which was important when they're doing these plantation raids, or even if they're revolting against colonial power. This was definitely the biggest thing within the First Maroon War. I don't think that the colonial power knew or understood the strength that both of the Maroon bands carried, which is why I think it led to them creating these treaties in 1739 with both the Windward and the Leeward bands. The next thing that I'm going to focus on is the Leeward band. The Leeward band, many would say, was the most organized band within many Maroon societies. So this band was led by Goucher, whom was a Creole slave. However, with this new band, Goucher had so many laws and tactics that he used in order for this band to be successful. So one of the first tactics that Goucher used was limiting the usage of African languages and cultures. His biggest thing was making sure that there was no jealousy within the band. He wanted to make sure that everyone was doing the same thing, speaking the same language, practicing the same religion, wearing the same outfits and clothes and colors. He wanted to make sure that there was no subgroups within the band. He didn't want any separation because that's what caused more problems than what they were already having with colonial power. He wanted everybody to stay united. That was the biggest thing. No one was different. Everyone was the same. Although everyone had different backgrounds, obviously. Some people were Creole slaves. Some people were born in Africa and were taken from their homes and escaped to one of the bands. He still wanted everyone to be united and to kind of look the same, talk the same, in order to keep things uniformed and organized just in case something were to happen. And I think that this definitely worked in the Leeward band's favor just because they were so organized. Another thing that really worked in their favor was the limiting the amount of colonial power they were killing. So Goucher had a law where when they went to go do plantation raids, they had one job: to extract these natural resources, as far as sugar or clothing or guns or whatever they wanted to take, extract those goods, Women, which I'll talk briefly about in another slide, was another big thing as far as what they were taking from these plantation raids, but they did not kill white people because they didn't want to create bigger issues with colonial power. Obviously, it's already the bigger problem of them taking slaves or being runaway slaves. They didn't want an even worse issue for the relationship that they shared. So Cujo definitely limited the amount of colonial power that were being killed by the Leeward band. Now, this is something that the Windward band did not adopt, which I'll talk briefly about when I talk about that slide. However, Cujo did sign the first treaty with the English in 1739, and I'll talk briefly about the terms that were made with both Windward and the Leeward band. The next thing that I'm going to focus on is the Windward band. Now, this band was located in the Blue Mountains, so they definitely had more advantage over the Leeward band as far as the natural barriers that I talked about earlier, just because they were in the actual mountains and they had those the vegetation areas and things of that nature. So they didn't have any definitive leader like the Leeward band had Cujo. They didn't really have that Cujo for the Windward band. However, they did have Quay, who signed the first treaty with the English 2 months after Cujo signed the treaty with the English in 1739. He definitely played a huge role in the Windward band as far as political decisions or anything that they did. Quay definitely had a huge impact on that. Now, another important and an influential leader within the Windward band was Nanny, whom I'll talk about a little later. She led a movement with the Windward band against the colonial power. But again, the Windward band was definitely organized and they definitely had plenty of skillful tactics that worked in their favor. However, again, like I said earlier, they did not adopt that law of not killing colonial power. So that was the one thing that kind of held back for the Windward band with the colonial power, was that they definitely killed a lot of colonial power when they did their plantation raids or just in general. Which is another reason why a lot of, especially like Nanny Town or another town that I don't know how to pronounce, unfortunately, was the first thing that colonial power attacked once they were able to reach the Blue Mountains and to be in the Windward band territory. They did get rid of a lot of the bands that was in the Windward band's territory. So again, the second treaty was signed with the English 2 months after Cujo signed in 1739 by Quay, and I'll also go over those terms later on in the presentation. The next thing that I'm going to focus on is women's role in both Leeward and the Windward band. So the first being more so domestic work as far as farming, cooking, and housekeeping, which is kind of found throughout history as far as women's role. And we see that again with the Jamaican Maroon societies. The next would be reproduction. This issue was mainly found in the Leeward band, where they would create certain laws like women being able to have multiple husbands or having children with different men, and this was not an issue in the Leeward band because they definitely had an issue with women, the amount of women in the band, and children. And again, Cujo really wanted to create this new society or a new culture of Black Creole culture. That's something that was very important to him. So having the system of reproduction and creating new Maroons to be able to promote this Creole society was very important for Cujo. And again, this is also found in the Windward bands, but they didn't have as strict laws as the Leeward band had for women as far as reproduction. The next was teaching children the science of Black Creole culture. Again, this is found in the Leeward band. Like I said earlier, Cujo really wanted to limit the amount of African culture or traditions and languages that was happening in the Leeward band. He really wanted to limit that because he wanted structure. So he definitely pushed a lot on teaching children the science, as they would call it, of Black Creole culture. That was the most important thing. Cujo was Creole, and again, like I said, this is mostly found in the Leeward band. The last thing is set girls. So set girls definitely were very, very important. A lot of people don't know about set girls, but they played a huge role in both bands. They served as the entertainment for both the Leeward and Windward and any other band that were created during this time period. Set girls had their own category. They had African set girls, they had Creole set girls, they had French set girls, they had Jamaican set girls. It just kind of depended on what women or the race or the type of girl that were in each band. Now, this definitely created some controversial issues within bands, which Cujo was definitely trying to limit. However, again, it was a women's matter, so I don't think that Cujo was necessarily thinking about, what girl was in which set, but they served as the entertainment for both bands. Now, the set girls, they got these nice costumes, or they would create these different type of costumes or uniforms, and that would come from plantation raids. So sometimes when the guys would come back, they would have clothing or cloth or anything of that nature, and they would use that to create these outfits so they could perform for the bands as they celebrate victories or coming back from plantation raids or just anything. That's what that was used for as far as the set girls. And as you can see on the side, here's a picture of a more modern day set girl. As you can see, her clothes very fancy. She has feathers and things of that nature. So this is definitely an earlier picture of set girls. The next thing that I'm going to focus on is an important figure named Nanny, who played a huge role in Jamaican Maroon history. So Nanny was a part of the Windward band. She was one of the few that led the movement with the Windward band against colonial power. She was a woman, which is like very important, just because earlier in the presentation I talked about women's role, and a lot of women's role didn't have anything to do with revolts. So the fact that Nanny, a woman, led a movement with the Windward band is important, and it's compelling, and it's something that needs to be talked about more. Nanny is only found 3 times in actual primary sources. She's only found, her name is mentioned 3 times. That is all. Other than that, it's mostly talking about Cujo and his representation, or Quay. However, Nanny is not mentioned, and the 3 times that she is mentioned, it's not about her movement with the Windward band. It's mostly just talking about her presence and a woman and obey a woman, but it's not talking about what she actually did. So the one thing that these sources did talk about was her magical figure, which is something that we see throughout history. Marie Laveau is a perfect example of this magical creature, person who's able to use powers to make white people, or people in general, do crazy things. She was named the Voodoo Queen. Or even Harriet Tubman, her giving like these magical powers to set slaves free, but not just being women. So that's definitely an interesting factor that we see even in the Jamaican Maroon example of a woman actually doing realistic things, helping out persons within the Windward band, revolting against colonial power for freedom, fighting alongside with other comrades, doing the work, and kind of just being like a slap in the face to say she was a magical figure, or she wasn't real, but she was real, and she actually led a movement, and she actually did the work with other comrades in order to have freedom for the Maroon bands in 1739. So she's definitely an important factor of Maroon history, and even still to this day in Jamaica, she is the face of the $500 bill. So Nanny definitely plays a huge role in Jamaican history in general. The last thing that I'm going to focus on is this idea of violence to alliance, as many will call it. However, a few other historians and myself see this as a way of containment of Maroon bands in Jamaica. And I think that this is something that we see throughout history for the African and the African American communities during this time period. Even in America, after slavery ended, they still had this idea of what freedom looked like for African Americans. It didn't necessarily change. They weren't able to do what they wanted to do. They had all these laws, Jim Crow laws, or even acts that said, okay, you have to take a literacy test to vote, or you have to, the grandfather clause. There were so many things that was placed on top of what freedom looked like for African Americans. And it's the same for Jamaican Maroons in 1739 when that first treaty was signed. When you look at the clauses of this treaty, it's not saying, okay, this is the end of the war and you guys are able to roam Jamaica as you please, and what, you can start your own plan, or whatever. That's not what it is. It's completely different. It's them controlling what these Maroon bands are able to do. I think that one of the bigger issues for the English was that they didn't want an early Haitian Revolution, in a sense, just because the Haitian Revolution happened maybe 4 decades before, after this. So I think they didn't want another 85 years of revolting and fighting against these maroon bands because they obviously weren't going to back down. They wanted their freedom. And this was seen without this year of turmoil that we have with the maroon bands and the English government. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the terms in this treaty, just to kind of see some of the ways that the English wanted to contain the maroon bands. First being any slaves that ran away to either Leeward or Windward bands were to be returned to their owners. So again, that's kind of controlling who's able to come in and out of these bands and keeping the bands at its steady pace. Okay, at the end of this the war in 1739, they'll have, let's just say for instance, 300 runaway slaves, and that's what it'll end at. These bands are not going to grow. After everyone is gone, they're gone. They're not reproducing because they don't have women. That was definitely a huge issue. So anyone that's running away, they has to be immediately returned, or that ends the treaty. Again, controlling what the freedom looks like for each band, and that's an issue. Another issue was that they weren't able to actually roam the island as they pleased. They had to stay 3 miles from plantations. They were not able to walk on a plantation. They weren't able to come 3 miles into a plantation. Again, controlling mobility. That's another issue. They wanted to control their mobility. If you're not able to go 3 miles into a plantation, then we know you're not going to raid our plantations. If you're not able to continue to have runaway slaves come into your bands, you're not going to continue to grow. They wanted to stop. They wanted to destabilize these bands. They wanted to end the mobility that they had before these treaties were created. That was their end goal. So again, I don't think this was a form of alliance, because we see that a few decades later, the Second Maroon War, which I'm not really going to talk much about, but we see a few decades later, the Second Maroon War happens because of these terms that were created by the English. So again, this is an interesting relationship that the Maroon bands and the English government shares throughout history. And it's definitely something that we see throughout history, even with the Jamaican government, or even in America, or even with the Haitian Revolution. This is seen throughout history multiple times.